What happens when one of music's biggest legends comes face to face with daytime television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Cher sits down on The View and Behar decides to push every single button she can find. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how not to treat a guest, and the explosive fallout that follows will leave you speechless. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of The View was supposed to be a celebration. Cher was appearing to promote her new memoir and discuss her legendary career spanning over 5 decades. What started as promotional appearances quickly devolved into one of the most uncomfortable moments in daytime television history. The tension was palpable from the moment Cher walked onto that stage, but nobody could have predicted just how ugly things were about to get. The atmosphere in the studio felt different from the start. While the other co-hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Haynes, and the rest of the panel, seemed genuinely excited to welcome the icon, Behar sat with a smirk that suggested she had other plans entirely. As Cher settled into her chair, radiant in a black sequin jacket that caught the studio lights perfectly, she appeared relaxed and ready to share stories about her incredible journey. Little did she know, Joy had been preparing for this moment with what can only be described as calculated malice. Well, Joy began, her voice dripping with a condescending tone that immediately put everyone on edge. Look who's decided to grace us with her presence. The goddess herself, Cher. The way she emphasized goddess made it clear this wasn't meant as a compliment. Cher's smile faltered slightly, her eyes narrowing as she processed the unexpected hostility. It's great to be here, Cher replied diplomatically, though her posture had already shifted defensively. I've always enjoyed coming on The View. Joy leaned forward, that trademark smirk growing wider. Oh, have you? Because, from what I understand, you've been pretty vocal about not liking certain aspects of daytime television lately. In fact, didn't you say in a recent interview that most talk shows are mindless drivel? The other co-hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances. Whoopi tried to interject with a laugh. Well, Joy, I think we can all agree that— No, let her answer. Joy cut her off sharply, her eyes never leaving Cher's face. I'm genuinely curious about this. Here you are, promoting your book on the very shows you apparently despise. Seems a bit hypocritical, don't you think? Cher's jaw tightened visibly. She'd been in the entertainment industry long enough to handle difficult interviewers, but this felt personal. I never said that about The View specifically, she replied, her voice remaining controlled but with an edge creeping in. And I certainly didn't use the words mindless drivel. Oh, but you did say something along those lines, didn't you? Joy pressed, reaching for a tablet in front of her with theatrical flourish. I have the quote right here, if you'd like me to refresh your memory. The studio audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the warm, celebratory interview they'd come to see. Sarah Haynes attempted to steer the conversation back on track. Cher, tell us about the new memoir. What inspired you to write it now? But Joy wasn't having it. Before Cher could answer, she jumped back in with renewed aggression. Actually, let's talk about inspiration. Because I'm inspired by people who own their words. You've made a career out of reinventing yourself, changing your image whenever it suits you. Some might say that's authentic evolution. Others might call it opportunistic calculation. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Cher's eyes flashed with a mixture of hurt and anger that she was clearly struggling to contain. Excuse me, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously low register. Are you seriously questioning my authenticity right now? Joy shrugged with mock innocence. I'm just saying what a lot of people are thinking. You've been everything from a folk singer to a disco queen to a movie star to a Twitter activist. At what point do we start wondering who the real Cher actually is? The other panelists looked mortified. This had crossed every line of professional courtesy. But Joy was just getting started. She leaned back in her chair with satisfaction, clearly enjoying the discomfort she'd created. The real Cher, Cher began, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury, is someone who's worked her ass off for over 50 years in an industry that's tried to tear her down at every turn. The real Cher is someone who's never pretended to be anything other than exactly who she is in any given moment. But that's just it, isn't it? Joy fired back. You change who you are whenever it's convenient. When it was trendy to be anti-establishment, you were anti-establishment. When it became profitable to be mainstream, suddenly you're mainstream. Some people might call that survival. But I call it— You call it what? Cher interrupted, her composure finally beginning to crack. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as everyone realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Joy smiled that infuriating smile again. I call it exactly what it is. Calculated reinvention, designed to stay relevant at any cost. But what happened next would prove that Joy Behar had severely underestimated exactly who she was dealing with, and the legendary performer was about to remind everyone why you don't mess with an icon who's survived and thrived in Hollywood for 5 decades. The silence that followed was deafening. Cher's eyes had transformed from hurt to something far more dangerous. The steely determination of a woman who had clawed her way to the top of an unforgiving industry and wasn't about to let anyone tear her down on national television. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of every battle she'd ever fought and won. You know what, Joy? Cher said, sitting forward in her chair, her famous voice taking on that unmistakable edge that had intimidated record executives and movie producers for decades. I've sat through a lot of interviews in my life. I've dealt with sexist journalists, ageist critics, and people who wanted nothing more than to see me fail. But I have never, and I mean never, encountered someone so deliberately cruel and unprofessional. Joy's smirk faltered slightly, but she doubled down. Oh, please, don't play the victim card now. You're a public figure. This comes with the territory. The territory? Cher's voice rose, and for the first time, the other co-hosts could see the full force of her legendary temper beginning to surface. The territory includes respect, Joy, something you clearly know nothing about. The audience was dead silent now, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Whoopi Goldberg looked like she wanted to crawl under the table, while Sarah Haynes kept glancing toward the producers off camera with panic in her eyes. But Joy wasn't backing down. If anything, Cher's reaction seemed to embolden her further. Respect has to be earned, she shot back with venom. And frankly, I'm not sure what you've done lately to earn it besides posting political tweets and showing up to award shows in increasingly desperate attempts to recapture your youth. The gasp from the studio audience was audible. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut to commercial. This had gone from uncomfortable to downright vicious. Cher's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then something that made everyone in the studio take notice. She began to laugh, but it wasn't a humorous laugh. It was the kind of laugh that preceded absolute destruction. My youth, Cher repeated, her voice dripping with incredulous fury. Joy, honey, let me tell you something about youth. When I was young, I was told I wasn't pretty enough, wasn't talented enough, wasn't smart enough. I was told I'd never make it past my first hit song. Do you know what I did with those predictions? She paused, letting the question hang in the air like a sword about to drop. I proved every single one of them wrong. I've sold over 100 million records worldwide. I've won an Academy Award, a Grammy, an Emmy, and 3 Golden Globes. I've had #1 hits in 6 different decades. 6 decades, Joy. How many decades have you been relevant? The attack was surgical and devastating. Joy's face began to redden, but Cher wasn't finished. You want to talk about desperate attempts to stay relevant? Let's talk about a talk show host whose claim to fame is being needlessly cruel to guests who were gracious enough to appear on her show. Let's talk about someone whose idea of journalism is ambushing people with gotcha questions and personal attacks. Joy tried to interrupt. Now wait just a minute. No, you wait a minute. Cher exploded, her voice echoing through the studio with such force that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the set. I came here as a courtesy. I came here to talk about my book, my life, my experiences. I did not come here to be insulted by someone whose biggest accomplishment is making other people miserable on daytime television. The other co-hosts sat frozen, watching this legendary performer dismantle their colleague with the precision of a master craftsperson. Sarah Haynes looked like she was about to cry, while Whoopi seemed torn between stopping the carnage and letting it play out. Joy's face had gone from red to purple. "You can't talk to me like that," she sputtered, her usual confidence completely shattered. Cher stood up slowly, her 5'8" frame seeming to tower over everyone else at the table, despite still being seated across from Joy. "I can talk to you however I want, Joy. Because unlike you, I've earned that right through talent, hard work, and decades of treating people with the respect you seem incapable of showing." The tension in the studio was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Production assistants were frantically trying to get the attention of the co-hosts, making frantic wrap-it-up gestures. But nobody seemed to know how to stop what had become a full-scale war. Joy made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This is my show," she declared with false bravado. Cher's response would become the moment that defined not just this interview, but Joy Behar's entire career. Looking directly into Joy's eyes with the intensity of a woman who had stared down every obstacle Hollywood could throw at her, Cher delivered the knockout punch that would leave everyone speechless. "Your show?" Cher said with devastating calm. "Joy, darling, this isn't your show. This is The View. And right now, The View is of a woman who's forgotten that being a host means showing hospitality, not hostility. But don't worry. I'm about to give you and your audience a view they'll never forget." And with those words, Cher began to rise from her chair, her sequined jacket catching the studio lights like armor, as she prepared to deliver what would become the most talked-about exit in daytime television history. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath as Cher stood to her full height, every inch the superstar she'd been for over 5 decades. Her movements were deliberate, calculated, and absolutely commanding. This wasn't just a guest leaving an interview. This was a master class in dignity under fire, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Joy," Cher said, her voice now carrying a tone of almost maternal disappointment that was somehow more devastating than any scream could have been. "I actually used to respect you. Years ago, when you were doing stand-up, when you were fighting for your place in comedy as a woman, I thought you had guts. I thought you understood what it meant to be underestimated and to prove people wrong." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Cher raised a perfectly manicured hand that commanded instant silence. "But somewhere along the way, you forgot where you came from. You forgot what it's like to be the underdog. Instead of lifting other women up, you've chosen to tear them down. Instead of celebrating success, you've chosen to mock it. And that, Joy, is not just unprofessional, it's pathetic." The camera operators continued rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming television gold. The other co-hosts sat in stunned silence, knowing that intervening now would only make things worse. Cher reached down and picked up her purse with the same elegance she'd displayed, accepting her Oscar decades earlier. "I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between tough questions and deliberate cruelty. What you've done here today isn't journalism, it isn't entertainment, and it certainly isn't professional. It's schoolyard bullying with a television audience." Joy finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "You can't just walk out of an interview." Cher turned back to face her tormentor one final time, and the look in her eyes was pure steel. "Watch me." But she wasn't quite finished. Cher had one more devastating blow to deliver, and she was going to make it count. "You asked me earlier about authenticity, Joy. About who the real Cher Island. Well, let me tell you exactly who I am. I'm someone who's never forgotten that behind every celebrity, every public figure, every guest who sits in that chair, there's a human being who deserves basic respect. I'm someone who's learned that true strength doesn't come from tearing others down, but from building them up." She paused, looking directly into the camera that had been focused on her throughout this entire ordeal. "I'm someone who's survived and thrived in an industry that chews people up and spits them out, not by stepping on others, but by staying true to myself and treating people with dignity. And most importantly, I'm someone who knows when it's time to leave." With that, she turned toward Joy one last time. "You want to know what separates a legend from just another television personality, Joy? A legend knows when to make an exit that people will remember forever. A television personality doesn't know when to stop talking. The insult hit its mark perfectly. Joy's face had gone completely white. Her usual bravado nowhere to be found. Cher adjusted her purse strap and looked around the set one final time. "Ladies," she said, nodding respectfully to the other co-hosts, "it's been a pleasure meeting you. I'm sorry your colleague doesn't understand the concept of professional courtesy." She began walking toward the exit, her heels clicking decisively on the studio floor. But Joy, in a final desperate attempt to salvage some dignity, made the mistake of getting in one last word. "Running away when things get tough, typical," Joy called out. Cher stopped dead in her tracks. The entire studio froze. Slowly, deliberately, she turned around with a smile that could have cut glass. "Running away?" Cher repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Honey, I'm not running anywhere. I'm making a choice. I'm choosing not to waste another second of my valuable time on someone who clearly has nothing valuable to contribute to any conversation worth having." She took a step closer to Joy's position at the table, her presence so commanding that it seemed to fill the entire studio. "You see, Joy, when you've accomplished what I've accomplished, when you've survived what I've survived, when you've earned the respect of your peers and the love of millions of fans worldwide, you get to choose where you spend your energy, and I choose not to spend it here." The final blow came with surgical precision. "But don't worry about me, Joy. Worry about yourself, because tomorrow I'll still be Cher, and you'll still be the person who thought it was a good idea to attack a guest who came here out of courtesy. Good luck with that reputation." With those words, Cher turned and walked toward the exit with the same grace and dignity she'd displayed throughout her entire career. The studio audience, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, began to applaud. It started as a few scattered claps, but quickly grew into thunderous approval that echoed throughout the studio. Cher didn't acknowledge the applause. She didn't need to. She simply walked off that set with her head held high, leaving behind a devastated Joy Behar, a mortified production crew, and a studio full of people who had just witnessed the most epic takedown in daytime television history. As the applause continued to ring out, Joy sat slumped in her chair, the reality of what she'd just done finally sinking in. She had picked a fight with a legend and gotten completely destroyed in front of millions of viewers. The other co-hosts looked anywhere but at their colleague, knowing that this moment would define not just this episode, but potentially Joy's entire career going forward. Cher's exit had been everything it needed to be: powerful, dignified, and absolutely unforgettable. She had proven once again why she remained an icon after all these years, and why some people should never be underestimated. The View would continue, but it would never be quite the same after the day Cher reminded everyone what true star power looks like when pushed too far.